Dust kicked up behind the bank's truck as it pulled onto his property, two men stepping out with a folder of paperwork and a seizure notice already printed. Standing near his barn, a Kansas rancher watched them tape it to his gateland his family had ranched for 3 generations. Gone in a matter of weeks. Yes, this really happened. They really did laugh when he warned them their numbers were wrong. And in that Kansas courtroom, the judge really did go pale for a reason nobody in that room expected. Comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Walter Reeves had run cattle on this stretch of Kansas prairie for 38 years, inheriting the operation from his father, who'd inherited it from his own father before him. 2,000 acres of grazing land, a herd that fluctuated between 400 and 600 head depending on the season, and a mortgage he'd taken out a decade earlier to build a new equipment barn and expand his water infrastructure during a brutal drought stretch. He'd never missed a payment. Not once in 10 years. That record mattered to him, a point of quiet pride he mentioned to anyone who asked how he'd kept the ranch running through years that broke plenty of his neighbors. The trouble started with a letter citing an unpaid balance from 18 months earlier. A balance Walter was certain didn't exist. He pulled his own bank statements immediately and found every payment cleared, every month, right on schedule. Convinced this was a simple clerical mix-up, he drove into town to sort it out in person, statements in hand. The loan officer barely glanced at his paperwork. When Walter explained the discrepancy and insisted the bank's records had to be wrong, the man actually laughed a short, dismissive laugh that echoed a little too loudly for the small office. "Sir, our system doesn't just invent debt," the officer said. "Maybe check your own math before you come in here accusing us of a mistake." Walter left that office angrier than he'd been in years, but angrier still because nobody had bothered to actually look at what he'd brought them. He tried calling twice more over the following weeks, each time getting a different representative who repeated the same line: the balance was valid, the foreclosure process had already begun, and there was nothing further to discuss without a formal written dispute. That evening, sitting at his kitchen table, Walter spread out every bank statement, loan document, and payment confirmation he'd saved since taking out the mortgage. He worked through them chronologically, checking each payment date against the bank's claimed default history. Everything matched until he reached a payment from 18 months earlier that had been processed through a different account number than every other payment on record. He stared at that account number for a long time. It wasn't a typo, not a single-digit error that could be explained by a distracted teller. It was an entirely different account, one he didn't recognize, buried inside otherwise flawless records. Whatever had happened, it looked far more deliberate than a simple clerical mistake, and Walter intended to find out exactly what it meant before the bank took another inch of his land. Walter drove into town the next morning and stopped by the county recorder's office, a place he rarely had reason to visit, hoping someone there could explain what an unfamiliar account number was doing buried inside his mortgage payment history. The clerk on duty, a woman who'd worked there for over 20 years, ran the number through the county's records, and went quiet for a moment before telling him this account wasn't linked to his mortgage at all. It belonged to a separate commercial loan, filed under the same bank branch. That detail didn't make sense to Walter, and it didn't sit right with the clerk either. She suggested he speak with an attorney before going back to the bank a third time, especially since bank employees clearly weren't taking his concerns seriously on their own. Before we get to what that attorney uncovered, hit subscribe, because what Walter found next turned a simple payment mix-up into something the bank never expected anyone outside their own office to discover. He found a rural property attorney 2 counties over who agreed to review his documents the same week. Laying out the statements, the mismatched account number, and the county clerk's explanation, Walter watched the attorney's expression shift from mild interest to genuine focus. This wasn't just an $18-month-old payment being misfiled, the attorney explained. If that 18-month-old payment had been redirected into a separate commercial account rather than applied to Walter's mortgage balance, the resulting default the bank was using to justify the entire foreclosure may have been artificially manufactured by the bank's own internal error, not caused by anything Walter had done wrong. Filing a formal request for the bank's complete internal transaction records triggered exactly the kind of resistance Walter had come to expect. The bank's legal team requested multiple extensions, citing the complexity of pulling records across separate account systems, a delay that struck both Walter and his attorney as unusual for what should have been a straightforward internal audit. When the records finally arrived, just over a week before the scheduled court hearing, Walter's attorney spent several late nights cross-referencing account activity across both the mortgage account and the mysterious commercial account the misapplied payment had landed in. What he found went well beyond Walter's individual case. The commercial account in question belonged to a large equipment leasing company that, coincidentally or not, had taken out a loan through the exact same branch during the exact same month as Walter's misapplied payment, raising an uncomfortable question about how many other customers' payments might have been affected by the same processing error. The Kansas courtroom filled with more people than usual that morning, word having spread locally that Walter's case had grown into something bigger than a routine foreclosure hearing. The bank sent 2 attorneys and a branch operations manager, still treating the proceeding as a formality they expected to close quickly in their favor. Walter's attorney opened by walking the judge through the misapplied payment, laying the mortgage statements beside the commercial account records obtained through discovery. The bank's lead attorney dismissed it initially as an isolated data entry error, unfortunate but immaterial to the larger validity of the foreclosure, and pushed to proceed regardless. Then Walter's attorney introduced what he'd found while cross-referencing the commercial account's broader activity. He explained that the account Walter's payment had been misapplied into wasn't just any account. It belonged to an equipment leasing company that had defaulted on its own loan through that same branch 8 months earlier, a default the bank had aggressively pursued in a separate, still active legal case. Walter's misapplied payment had, in effect, been counted by the bank's own internal system as a partial payment toward that defaulted commercial loan, quietly helping offset losses on a completely unrelated account while Walter's own mortgage was simultaneously marked delinquent for the exact same missing amount. The branch operations manager, called to respond, insisted this had to be a processing coincidence, that the bank's systems didn't allow customer payments to cross between unrelated accounts without manual intervention. Walter's attorney then produced an internal transaction log, obtained through discovery, showing a manual account override on the exact date of the misapplied payment, a step that required a bank employee to deliberately redirect it. The judge, who had remained largely silent through the earlier testimony, asked the operations manager directly who had authorized that manual override and why. She hesitated, glanced toward the bank's attorneys, and admitted the log didn't specify a reason, only an employee ID number tied to a supervisor no longer working at that branch. Reading through the timeline again, Walter's clean decade of payments, the manual override, the defaulted commercial account, quietly benefiting from his misdirected funds. The 18 months during which the bank pursued foreclosure on a man who owed nothing. The judge's expression changed. Color visibly drained from his face as he set the documents down, the full scope of what he was looking at settling in front of the entire courtroom. This wasn't a clerical mistake anymore. It looked, at minimum, like negligent mishandling of customer funds to cover unrelated institutional losses, and at worst, something considerably more troubling. The judge didn't take long to rule once the full picture was in front of him. He dismissed the foreclosure entirely, ordered the bank to immediately correct Walter's mortgage balance to reflect the misapplied payment, and ordered the bank to cover Walter's full legal costs. But he didn't stop there. He formally referred the manual override finding to state banking regulators, specifically flagging the possibility that customer funds had been redirected to offset unrelated institutional losses, a practice that, if proven systemic, could carry serious regulatory consequences well beyond Walter's individual case. Word of the ruling spread through the ranching community within days, and it wasn't long before the bank's phones were reportedly ringing with customers asking whether their own payment histories might contain similar irregularities. State regulators opened a formal inquiry into the branch's account practices, requesting records stretching back several years to determine how widespread the manual override practice had actually been. For Walter, the ranch was fully his again, mortgage balance corrected, foreclosure erased from his record entirely. He kept every one of his bank statements in a fireproof box after that, a habit he said he wished he'd started years earlier. Neighbors who'd heard the story started asking questions of their own banks, several discovering minor discrepancies they'd never thought to check before. What stayed with people who followed the case wasn't just that Walter won, though that mattered plenty to a man who'd nearly lost land 3 generations of his family had built. It was the reminder that being laughed at for raising a concern doesn't make that concern wrong, and that sometimes the difference between losing everything and keeping it comes down to one stubborn afternoon spent cross-referencing account numbers at a kitchen table. Walter's cattle still graze those 2,000 acres today, the same fence lines his grandfather once walked. Now backed by a paper trail he'll never stop keeping. A misplaced account number, buried in 18 months of otherwise perfect records, nearly cost Walter everything until his own stubbornness exposed a bank's hidden override. His fight protected far more than his own land. If this story moved you, subscribe for more real stories of people who refused to back down.